Hey juniors, good to see you this Sunday afternoon. I am proactively recording my video in the afternoon instead of waiting till 1 in the morning the day before or early in the morning the day of. So I'm a little ahead of the game. So today we are going to segue into World War II. So I'm going to guess that a lot of this will sound familiar as well. I would like to encourage you to print off the PowerPoint or at least take notes. I am going to be giving you an open note quiz that will happen probably at the end of our discussion of World War II. You will have a test the last week of school that's going to be over all of the material on our special people and events from, I guess, 2 weeks ago from now. So the first one was Teddy Roosevelt, and then the next one was, what was the next one? The Great Depression and President Hoover, and then World War I. Actually, it was World War I first, and then the Great Depression with President Hoover. And now we're going to segue into World War II. So, sorry, I'm a little tired. So, if you hear noise in the background, I'm sitting in the at my dining room table, actually, living room in the background, and my family is running around in and out. And we're all kind of getting on each other's nerves, full disclosure there. And they're not very happy that I am recording from the middle of the house, because they're having to accommodate me. So I just needed a different spot. I've been stuck in my bedroom for several hours and I needed to move. So you may hear them coming and going, and we'll just ignore them. So all that said, make sure that you take good notes. The quiz will be, and the test for that matter, will be over any information that I share during the video, during my video lectures, as well as anything that I ask you to read and anything that's in the PowerPoint. So you would be greatly helped to print off the text part of the PowerPoint presentations and have them available to take notes in. If you do not have access to a printer, you could actually type notes into the PowerPoint, or you can just do old school, old-fashioned handwrite notes in a notebook as we're jibber-jabbering here. So I would strongly encourage you to do that, because since we're not basing most of our information specifically on the textbook, a little bit, but not per se. This is information that you want to make sure that you write down if it's not specifically in the PowerPoint. So this particular lesson on the events leading up to World War II and World War II Part 1, basically, there are lots of video links that I'll be encouraging you to veer off and go watch in the middle of a specific thing that we're talking about. So make sure that you follow the cues of the PowerPoint. Also, I have been told that several people have been, I don't know if it's in your class or in general, but just across the board, kids have been watching teachers' videos and whatnot, kind of on double time speed or extra fast speed. Which, you know, you're juniors, and if you're doing that, then maybe you can handle that just fine. Some of you struggle more than others academically, and I don't encourage you to do that. My lessons are designed to last for about 90 minutes. And I have noticed that kids would be turning in their Google forms saying that they had watched everything and looked at the PowerPoint and all of that in like 40 minutes in a 90-minute lesson. So that led me to ask some questions. And so you guys are old enough to know if you can actually do that. There are some things that you can watch a little extra, a little faster than normal, and it won't impact it too much. But I really discourage you from doing that. So we have 2 90-minute classes a week. Fridays for my class are, you don't have anything assigned unless you have homework. So I would really encourage you to pay close attention to the lectures and to make sure you watch the videos and anything I ask you to read. So from my just general observation, you guys are doing good at that. I'm more concerned about my freshmen because they're not quite at that point where they can do that well. So anyway, all right, so we're going to jump into our discussion about World War II. I'm fascinated by World War II. The decades between World War I and World War II, as I mentioned before, they really are connected. And the events, the way that World War I ended, the worldwide catastrophe that happened in between World War I and World War II with the Great Depression was a global depression, led to crazy people coming to power, especially in Europe, that catapulted the world into World War II. And so they are connected. You could call them the Great War from one bookend to the other bookend, but historians call them World War I now and World War II. If you recall, World War I initially was labeled the Great War, but it became known as World War I after World War II. So you're going to see a picture on your slide, on your PowerPoint, that shows you several images of the world in the 1930s. And so after the stock market crashed in 1929, upwards of 25% of the American population lost their jobs. There was not a government safety net in place significantly to help people. And so things were pretty dire. What we have going on in the world right now is with the coronavirus crisis, our government is trying to help us by providing funds for us, for people who have lost their jobs, unemployment insurance. The government is even giving small businesses loans that will they don't have to repay them if they use the loans to keep people employed and use that money to pay their employees rather than laying them off. Those sorts of things weren't in existence whatsoever during the Great Depression. Some states did introduce small unemployment benefits, but you had to really be in a serious situation to qualify, and there were really enough to feed you. And so those things just did not exist. And so the 10 years from the 1929 to 1939 were terrible, and it seemed like they were never going to end. Franklin Roosevelt was the president. He was elected in 1933. I think he actually became president in January of 1934. It was during the Roosevelt election that Congress introduced the amendment to the Constitution that moved the election, or the swearing in date of the president from March to January, because the situation was so dire that Congress, I think it was an amendment, I have to go back and look now, it was either a law or amendment, but they changed the date of the president, I think it was an amendment, swearing in to January instead of March, because if he's elected in November and doesn't take office until March, there's just so much dead time, and the country was in such bad shape, and FDR had just big ideas about how he was going to rescue the economy, that they changed the date. So he became president in January of 1934, I believe, and I probably need to check that. I'm sorry, 1933. He was elected in 1932, November, and took office in 1933. And so he came to the country with what he called the New Deal. He had a New Deal for America. Teddy Roosevelt had a Square Deal for America. His cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, had a New Deal. And essentially what that New Deal was lots and lots and lots of expansion of the federal government and programs intended to help those people that were suffering in the Great Depression. Everything from the Conservation Corps to regulations on banks, just a whole host of things. And we're actually not going to go into those things. Historians make the case that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, while it did expand the scope and power and size of the federal government immensely, that it also rescued America's economy. That's what some historians say. Other historians say that the manipulation of the free market by Franklin Roosevelt and the way that he manipulated it, that it actually extended the Depression longer than it would have naturally happened. That the markets would eventually have fixed themselves. Like if you remember, the initial crisis was in the stock market. There were other elements of the economy that were hurting, but the the straw that broke the camel's back was the stock market crash. And so the markets didn't correct. The government intervened in so many significant ways that the market didn't know what was real and what was regulation and what was manipulation. And so other historians say that the New Deal actually extended the Depression many more years than it needed to. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we'll never really know for sure. We have not had a situation quite like that since that time, and there have been regulations put in place in the stock market that will not allow it to lose more than 10% of its value in any given day without it being shut down. And that actually happened at the beginning of this coronavirus crisis. Our stock market lost 10% of its value 2 different days. Now it's since come back up again, but they actually shut down trading because of it, because of this shock to the system. And so we don't know for sure if the New Deal was good or bad. I suspect it was a little bit of both. But those programs did not fix the economy. What did fix the economy was World War II. The uptick of manufacturing related to the war industry put people to work and gave them a purpose and united people together and got the economy stimulated in such a way that we came above the crisis situation. And a lot of time, one of the main factors that is measured in a recession or a depression is the percentage of unemployment. How many people are unemployed, or what percentage of the population is working. And so with that said, the 1930s it was an interesting period of time in American history. And there's a slide here that shows just some images related to this era, and I'll just walk through them. The movies, people went to movies to entertain themselves. Some of them were silent movies, some of them, I can't remember when sound was introduced. Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, they were movie stars and they did lots and lots of dancing. I think Fred Astaire was in Singing in the Rain and others. And so if we were in class, when I used to teach this unit, I would show you a couple of scenes of their dancing. The radio was the in-home form of entertainment. Every American home pretty much had a radio. And so people would listen to stories and actors and dramas unfold, as well as, of course, President Roosevelt's fireside chats, where he would sit at the radio, the microphone, and he would talk to the American people directly into their homes to tell them that he said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And he calmed people who were very fearful about the state of the economy. The Wizard of Oz came out during this period, Gone with the Wind. There's that iconic painting, forgetting the name of it, of the farmer with this pitchfork, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was the first animated colored cartoon that came out, the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg was named after the previous chancellor of Germany, had a big Nazi swastika on the bottom of it, and it had flown from Germany over to the United States, and it exploded as everybody was watching. What else is on here? War of the Worlds. If you don't know the story of War of the Worlds, it was a drama played out on radio, but they did not tell people that it was a dramatization, and so people that were tuning in once it started thought that there had been an alien invasion. I think Tom Cruise did a remake of it in the last few years, and so it's just a really interesting time in American history. A lot of things changed in the entertainment industry, but people were a lot of times too poor to really enjoy them. So all of that was taking place in the 1930s. In the meantime, while we're over here kind of drowning and ignoring what's happening in the rest of the world, drowning our sorrows in what's happening on the home front, in the meantime, Europe is being pummeled by nationalism and negative nationalism. Dictators are popping up all over Europe that are about to catapult the world into another significant war. The most famous of those, of course, is Adolf Hitler. There is a picture of Adolf Hitler in an arena, and I believe this is where the 1936 World Olympics, or the Olympics were held. And Adolf Hitler is looking at his masses of his army marching in front of him. It's a really eerie picture. let's see here. So these are some of the world leaders that came to power during this intermediate time between World War I and World War II. So Joseph Stalin actually took the reins of the Soviet Union in 1924 when when Vladimir Lenin died. He was a communist. The Soviet Union ultimately was a conglomeration of, I think it was 14 countries, Russia being the largest of those, that were part of this communist Soviet sphere. Benito Mussolini arose out of the World War I ashes. He was a fascist. He came to power in Italy. Of course, Adolf Hitler and his Nazism. He became the chancellor, I believe, in 1933. In Japan, the military leaders were kind of controlling the emperor, and so they're defined as a militarist country, and ultimately they wanted to develop their empire, but they had very limited resources on the island, and so they began to look outward. So they were doing a lot of naughty stuff long before the war, actually, World War II started. And then in Spain, in the years right before World War II, Spain went through a revolution, and fascist leader Francisco Franco took over, and Adolf Hitler eyed him and Mussolini from a distance and liked what he saw and fashioned a lot of his governing off of Mussolini and Franco. Okay, so real quickly, I'm just going to walk through how these different forms of government are defined. So Joseph Stalin, communism is an economic theory favoring a classless society and the abolition of private property. So basically, the government takes ownership of all of the economic engines of the country. It is totalitarian in nature, meaning it's centralized control by an autocrat or a group of autocrats. Benito Mussolini, fascism is a government system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. So you see that in Nazism as well. Nazism is an ideology and practice of the Nazi Party, especially the policy of racist nationalism, national expansion, and state control of the economy. Militarism, the belief or desire of a government or people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and prepared to use it aggressively to defend or promote national interests. And then got Franco there again. All right. So let me just say that as this was happening in Europe, Americans were ignoring it. They did not have any desire to go back to Europe. Americans tend to be isolationists by nature, especially when you've got two oceans that separate you from the rest of it. If you go all the way back to Washington and Jefferson and John Adams, they understood the danger of getting involved in a European conflict. I mean, since the beginning of time, the Europeans had been fighting one another. And we didn't have to deal with that. We did come to the rescue during World War I, and that was in large part because our economy was dependent on international trade, as it is today. And as the economies of Europe declined, as war happened, and as our ability to trade with our allies, with our partners, decreased without risk of being, blown up by a submarine, Americans became more inclined and willing to get involved. The fact that most of us have European heritage and sympathized with or empathized with one or another of the European countries involved in those wars also contributed to our getting involved. But during the 1930s, we were in such a state that we really just had our head in the sand. President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, during the Depression, I would say saw the writing on the wall. He was not as much an isolationist as probably the American population, and he's hearing from world leaders, he's hearing from the leaders of the British that they're concerned about this growing dark front that's happening in Europe, specifically related to Adolf Hitler. Of course, Germany had been at the epicenter, or the front line of World War I, and they were concerned that this was going to happen again. And so, as early as 1937, Franklin Roosevelt, in one of his speeches, they called it the quarantine speech, began to talk to the American people about, hey, y'all, something bad is happening over there, and you need to understand that there may be a time coming where we need to intervene. And people didn't want to hear it. So, but it was his first kind of introduction of, hey, all right. So, so as time marches on and as Adolf Hitler gains power, more and more concentrated power in Europe, this is sort of the domino effect. There's a PowerPoint here that has pictures of the swastikas and dominoes falling. And so what I want to do right now, and this is in part just to hold you accountable that you are actually paying attention. What I'd like to do right now is after I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to go to your Google Classroom page, the streaming page where you can make public comments, and you're going to notice that there is a question that I'm going to propose to you guys, something along the lines of, what do you know about Adolf Hitler? What are your impressions or memories that you've learned about him over the years? Now, everybody's going to have something different. So what I'd like to see happen on that stream is that, let's say Brady Allison says, well, I know that he had a crazy mustache that he created or developed during World War I because of the gas mask getting stuck on his mustache. The next person might say, well, I remember studying that he was almost shot and killed in no man's land during World War I, and the British soldier decided to not kill him. And then the next person's going to jump in with something different, okay? So what it's going to require you to do is to read what other people know. Now, everybody's going to kind of come to this particular part of the PowerPoint or my lecture at a different point. So when you get to this question, what do you know about Adolf Hitler? I want you to hit the pause button. I want you to go into Google Classroom, and I want you to look and see what other people have written, and I want you to contribute something different. You can't say anything about how his mustache was created during World War I, and you can't say that he was almost killed in no man's land during World War I, okay? You can't say either one of those things. You have to come up with something different. And if you don't know anything different than what other people have said, what I'd like for you to do is segue to something else that you know about World War II, okay? So when that is completely exhausted and you can't think of anything else, then you can continue the conversation by talking about something. You can talk about the Holocaust, or what you know about the Luftwaffe, or the Battle of Britain, or the Battle of Dunkirk. But you need to at least first see if you can answer something about Adolf Hitler. So I expect everybody to contribute on that during our 90-minute block of time, and I look forward to seeing that. So hit the pause button, go add your conversation to the ongoing conversation, and then jump back into the lesson. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into my PowerPoint. My puppy is clawing at the door, so I'm going to try to ignore him for just a minute. All right, so this is how the dominoes fell in Europe. So Adolf Hitler consolidated his power, and the leaders of Europe became very nervous and very uncomfortable that he was going to do what his predecessor had, or what had happened in World War I. And they were right. They were right to be concerned. So Adolf Hitler was from Austria. That was his place of birth. He was German living in Austria. And in 1938, he essentially announced to the world that Germany was going to absorb Austria into the German Empire. I'm sorry that my dogs are barking in the background. Actually, is anybody here that can let the dogs in? We'll see. Okay, they just ran away. All right, and so the world was certainly concerned about this occurrence, but because Austria had been kind of carved out and reassigned during World War I think they felt like, you know, there's enough German-speaking people in Austria, and they seem to want to be part of the German Empire, that we're going to let it go. And then Adolf Hitler turned his eyes to another German-speaking part of his neighborhood, his hood. I'm going to have to let my dogs in. Hold on just a second. Come on in. My neighbors are mowing the lawn, and so they're so excited that they can bark at somebody. Okay. Oh, there's the other one. Hold on. Come on in. All right. All right, so the next country that Adolf Hitler began to eyeball was an area of Czechoslovakia, which was called the Sudetenland. And actually the Sudetenland was primarily German-speaking people that, again, probably had been German, part of the German Empire before World War I, but were reassigned during the Treaty of Versailles. And so I would say that Czechoslovakia was very freaked out that Adolf Hitler felt like he had the power without running any risk of being stopped, marching into the Sudetenland. But he literally marched his troops into the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in September. Let's see, it was September 30th, 1939. And he assumed that land. Now, the scary part is that Adolf Hitler actually met with European leaders, in particular a guy by the name of Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England. Chamberlain found Adolf Hitler to be reasonable, and Adolf Hitler told him, "Mr. Chamberlain, this is part of my people, this is part of my country. You understand that as a Brit. The British Empire extends around the globe. These are German-speaking people that are German, and they want to be part of Germany. Our economy has suffered for decades, or more than a decade since World War I. We need to absorb those German people patriotically, nationally, back into our family." And so Neville Chamberlain said, "Do you promise you won't take anything else?" And Adolf Hitler is like, "Promise, I won't, Boy Scouts honor, I won't take anything else. This is all I want." And so Neville Chamberlain and the other leaders signed an agreement with Adolf Hitler that they would turn their eyes away as he gobbled up this land that was not his, and they would do nothing about it because he had promised that he would not take anything else. And so Neville Chamberlain embarrassingly showed up in England, waving this agreement in his hand. He says, "I have secured peace for our time. Adolf Hitler has promised that he will take no more land, and this is all he wants." Unfortunately for Neville Chamberlain, he will very soon lose his job as Prime Minister because Adolf Hitler had other things in mind. Winston Churchill, who was a member of, I believe, the House of Lords at the time, very famous British politician who had served in World War I and served in the government and the Navy and a whole bunch of other things in England, was an outspoken opponent of Adolf Hitler's and Neville Chamberlain's, and said when Neville Chamberlain came back to England with this agreement, Winston Churchill famously said, "Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor by signing this agreement. They will soon have war." And wow, did he hit the nail on the head. Okay, so that was, let's see, September 30th of 1939. Oh, I'm sorry, I had the date wrong on there. That's supposed to say 1938. So in March of 1938, he took Austria. In September of 1938, he took the Sudetenland. He signed the agreement, promised he would not invade any other area. And then in March of the following year, so it was about 6 months later, Adolf Hitler organized his army and his air force, and he marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia with a little bit of resistance from the Czech army. And he announced to the world, Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. And then just a few months later, he and Joseph Stalin basically agreed secretly. It was called the Non-Aggression Pact. They secretly agreed to carve out Poland between the two of them. And on September 1st, 6 months after the rest of Czechoslovakia fell, Adolf Hitler marched into Poland from the west, and Joseph Stalin marched into Poland from the east. And the world realized that Adolf Hitler was in it to win it, as they say, that his ambition was way beyond anything they could imagine. Of course, he had been secretly and quietly developing his army and his air force and his submarines and his tanks and his weapons programs under the nose of the French and the British, who were unwilling to do anything about it. and hopes and prayers that he would not use them against them. My, were they wrong. So on September 3rd, as a result of the invasion of Poland, that was the precursor to the start of World War II, France and Great Britain both declared war on Germany. That was September 3rd, 1939. Let's see here. And then a few months later, April 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway and used their airstrips to attack England. In May, just a month later, Adolf Hitler invades Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And in May 10th of 1940, less than 9 months after they've taken all of Czechoslovakia, Adolf Hitler sends his armies into France. The French are completely unprepared. They have literally had their head in the sand as well. Now, fascinating picture that you'll see here on the screen or on the PowerPoint. It's one of my, I want to say historically one of my favorite pictures, not because it's a happy picture, but because of the momentous nature of this picture. So Adolf Hitler invades France in May 10th of 1940. He reaches Paris, France, by June 22nd. So in about a month's time, Adolf Hitler's army completely overwhelms the French armies and the British army that has come in to help the French, and has made his way all the way to Paris. Paris is about in the center of France, and there is a picture that you'll see here of Adolf Hitler and his cronies marching on the plaza underneath the Eiffel Tower. Now, I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a French person waking up that summer morning, getting a copy of the newspaper thrown at my door and opening it up to see Adolf Hitler and his cronies, like you'll see the picture, it's creepy, standing in front of my beloved Eiffel Tower. It must have been completely terrifying to them. Now, France had a number of, I'll call them refugees that had flooded into France, particularly Jewish refugees. Adolf Hitler started the the concentration camps as early as 1934, targeting Jewish people. Their laws were targeting Jewish people. And so Jewish people had been fleeing the country for a long time. And so now they thought that they were safe in France, and they're no longer safe. And many of them had been in Paris itself. And so a lot of especially the children who had been sent into France, Jewish children that has been sent into France by their parents, were now moved to the coast further south and west. It was terrifying. So the next picture that you will see here is a picture of Adolf Hitler and a couple of his associates. It's just the three of them standing on a bridge with the Eiffel Tower in the background. That particular image or that place on that bridge is still there. And a lot of people have reenacted that picture. And so when my husband and Chapman went to Paris a couple of years ago, I think it was right before Chapman's senior year, I sent them a picture of the bridge with some of the other pictures people had taken and asked them to recreate the picture. When they went up to the bridge, there's actually, there was a little fence in front of the actual place where Hitler was standing, and they didn't want people standing right there on the edge, but they actually have it protected now. I don't know if people fell off or what, but so I asked them to reenact it. So there's a picture there of my husband reenacting the picture. So he doesn't like Adolf Hitler, but I asked him to reenact that. Okay, so this is where it gets kind of weird. So Adolf Hitler, he despised the French, and the reason that he made such a to-do about going to the plaza under the Eiffel Tower and taking photographs was that he believed that everything evil that had happened in his life, everything wrong that had happened, was the fault of the French. The French humiliated the Germans. Of course, they have a history of fighting, but they humiliated the Germans at the end of World War I. Remember, the French made the Germans sign a war guilt clause, saying it's your fault that millions of people died in World War I. You are to blame. And so the German leaders signed those war guilt clauses, and then millions and millions and millions of dollars of reparations were put upon the German people. Basically, they had to pay for it. They were to blame. They had to pay for all of the damage from the war. And they couldn't. Their economy was collapsed. Their government had collapsed. They had lost millions of soldiers in the war, young men. And so for, 2 decades, they had been struggling to recover. Adolf Hitler is what helped them recover by ramping up manufacturing and war efforts and that sort of thing. And so he was determined he was going to embarrass the French. So the French had at the end of World War I, had basically created this ceremony in a train car where they invited the German delegation to come and sign these surrender and treaties. And it wasn't the Treaty of Paris, I don't think, but just the surrender. It was just a humiliating thing. And then they had taken that train car and they'd made this kind of national park out of it. This beautiful park where this train car set where the Germans had to surrender to the French during World War I, or at the end of World War I. So Adolf Hitler decided he was going to invite the French delegation to sign their surrender in the same train car at this same park with all of his Nazi troops surrounding it, and he was going to make a big to-do of it. So I actually have the video footage of that, and I want you guys to watch that. It's so interesting. There's pictures of it as well. It shows pictures of the original surrender after World War I and then the reboot, so to speak, by Adolf Hitler. But that was just in his nature. That's who he was. Let me see here real quick. I'm going to switch slides. So I want you to watch that. And then I'm going to back up just a smidge and hold on a second. Sorry, y'all. I'm combining a couple of different slides together. I will say that at the beginning of this PowerPoint, you are going to, there'll be a film strip prompting you to watch a short video. The first thing that I want you to do before you even watch my video lecture is I want you to watch about 10 minutes of this speech that Adolf Hitler gave to the Nazi Party. It's so fascinating to see the close-up expression and to hear him speak. And it was almost like he was an actor. They say that he would spend hours in front of the mirror practicing his speeches and how he was going to use his hands and his facial expressions and his intonations, almost like he was playing the part of an evil dictator. There's one part in this particular speech that you'll notice that he pauses and he hesitates and he kind of grins a little bit because he's so proud of himself and he can hear the applause, but he's supposed to be playing the part of an evil dictator, and so he gets serious again. But I want you to watch about 10 minutes of it before you actually start my lecture so you can kind of get a feel for him. But anyway, all right, so going back to where we were, so the French have surrendered. Thousands of British and French troops who were there to defend France and defend Paris have fled to a northern part of France against the English Channel to a town called Dunkirk. Sorry, my husband's mowing the lawn. I'm hearing the edger in the garage. And so they are trapped, thousands and thousands. I forgot to look at the numbers. Let me see if I've got the numbers here. I'm using last year's. Yeah, there it is. I'm using my PowerPoint from last year. And so this is, so they made it, they were in Paris by June 22nd, 1940. So the Battle of Dunkirk actually takes place between May and June during this, as the Germans are marching, heading to Paris. The troops that have been protecting Paris and the areas around that were essentially run out of town by the German Luftwaffe and the German army and the tanks and everything. And so they move up towards the English Channel trying to get their bearings. 400,000 troops, okay? Some of them French, some of them British. And the Germans push them all the way to the coastline where they are trapped. The English Channel is only about 35 miles or so from England to France. And so all of those troops get to Dunkirk, they hunker down, and they're hoping and praying to be rescued. But the problem is that the British and the French are not prepared for war, and their air force is not prepared for war against the German air force. And so Winston Churchill, who is now the Prime Minister of England, has to decide, do I send my battleships into the English Channel and let them get destroyed by the German Air Force before we're even in the battle? Or do I I let 400,000 men die on the beaches of Dunkirk. And many of you have seen the movie, The Battle of Dunkirk. It came out a couple summers ago. It's a little bit confusing if you don't know the history of Dunkirk, because it flashes back and forth between present and past and future, and it's kind of confusing. But it does a beautiful job of showing what it must have been like sitting on that beach, waiting and praying that a ship from England is going to come and rescue you. Well, what ends up happening is, I guess God preordained this, but Hitler orders the advance against these 400,000 troops to stop and to wait, to pause. And it provides I don't know, I'm going to say 12-hour window for these 400,000 soldiers to get rescued. I don't know if Hitler thought that they were being tricked, they were being lured to a situation. I'm not sure why he paused, but he paused. And he paused long enough for Winston Churchill really to come up with a brilliant idea. He essentially calls in every merchant ship, every fishing boat in the British Empire that's anywhere near the English Channel, and asks them to serve as rescue boats. Some of their battleships couldn't even get in there. Oh, they were too heavy, or those that had tried to meander into it were shot by some German airplanes that were serving as just kind of scouts. And so what ends up happening is you have a merchant navy that rescues 400,000 men. It is crazy. And I've got some pictures of the rescue operation. Lots and lots and lots of men died on that terrible, probably 24, 48-hour period of time, because the German Air Force, the few airplanes that were up front would come through and they just boom, 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 they would kill as many people as they can, they'd fly off. A few British airplanes got off the ground and acted as, interference. And so there were a number that died, but in total, almost 400,000 soldiers were rescued from that beach, and it's incredible. I've got a couple of clips from the movie Dunkirk in there that I want you to watch. Let's see here. After that particular event, when it became very clear that Adolf Hitler was psycho and that the future of Europe was in dire straits, Winston Churchill rose to the occasion after the Battle of Dunkirk and gave a very, very famous speech over the British airwaves on the radio, a speech called "We Shall Never Surrender." And because the truth is, this is the truth, the Battle of Britain began shortly after the Battle of Dunkirk. What the Battle of Britain was Adolf Hitler's intent to pummel the island of England, or Great Britain, United Kingdom, and to scare the English people or the British people into surrendering to him. Adolf Hitler truly believed that the will of the British Empire, the British people, when they felt the battle on their own soil and their own cities were bombed, like London was pummeled, thousands of civilians died in London, that they would surrender under Germany's terms. Germany's terms were, we will leave you alone, we will not occupy the island, we will let you continue to live your lives, you will just now be part of the German Empire. That was basically his deal. We don't want to control you, we don't want to occupy you, but we do want your resources and we want you to be a part of the German Empire. And if you agree to that, we won't kill you, we won't attack you, we won't destroy your cities. We'll leave you sitting on your little island. And Winston Churchill was like, are you kidding me? No. We shall never surrender a single inch of our island to you, Adolf Hitler. And so Hitler was kind of surprised by this. And so he spent a couple of months in the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain basically describes specifically those first 2 months after the Battle of Dunkirk, where the German army flew many, many bombing raids over London. And when Adolf Hitler recognized the cost to his Air Force, the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, destroyed over 500 or so German airplanes during those 2 months. And Adolf Hitler was like, you know what? It is not worth the loss that we're suffering. We'll just disregard Britain. We'll continue to fight them, but not in this capacity. And so he relented a little bit and quit bombing the island. And so England got a breath of fresh air. However, the battle continued. Winston Churchill was calling Franklin Roosevelt as often as he possibly could, asking him, pleading with him, we need America to enter this war on our side. We need you. We need you. We need you. We can't win without you. Roosevelt was like, I'm going to use the word dude. Dude, I'm sorry, but the American people are not on board with joining another European war and losing our blood on your soil. Can't do it. Sorry, it's not going to happen. I wish I could help you. I'm going to send you ammunition. I'm going to send you weapons. I'm going to loan you money when you can't afford. I'm going to loan you weapons when you can't afford the weapons anymore. I'm going to give you loans and you can pay me later. But the American people are not ready for war, and they weren't ready for war. That wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to come to fruition until the Japanese attacked us. Now, there are several pictures in this PowerPoint that show you images of London being attacked. And there's another short little video clip that I want you to watch. But it's amazing how much of the city of London was destroyed and how much of it was saved. The Royal Air Force was given orders to protect certain landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, London Bridge, all of those things, the Tower of London, and they were able to protect them while the rest of the city was crumbling. Everybody went underground at night. In fact, you guys remember the scene? I'll probably show it to you. I'll probably have you watch it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the very, very first movie where the kids are on the train in the subway system and they are sent out to the countryside and they go to live with the crazy professor. That's where they end up finding the wardrobe. That's happening at the beginning of World War II. The children of London were sent out to the countryside during the Battle of Britain. And Winston Churchill, the morning after, would come up and he would walk the city and look at the damage with the people, and the cameras would be rolling, and he would press on, we can defeat this enemy. And so he was a real encouragement to his people. I think I'm gonna go ahead and let's see here. I think I'm gonna end with this. So as I said before, yeah, there we go. As I said before, Winston Churchill was pleading with Roosevelt. He was traveling to the United States secretly, pleading with Roosevelt to encourage America to declare war against the Germans. And Americans were not willing. They just weren't willing until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And so England had been engaged in the battle with the Germans for a little over a year. Germany and Japan and Italy were all part of the Axis powers. They all had a treaty together to mutually protect one another in case they were attacked. And the Japanese were building their own empire. They weren't threatened by Germany. Germany was in another part of the world. But they wanted the power of having that ally in the fight. And so the Japanese decided that they would preemptively attack the United States Navy at our naval base in the Pacific Ocean in a place called Pearl Harbor, which is a natural harbor. It's where most of our Pacific fleet was on that particular day. The Japanese had been stalking it out for about a year, kind of knew the comings and going of the Navy. And they decided on a surprise attack because they believed that if they could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet before we got involved in the war, that by the time we were prepared to fight them, it would be too late. They would have already gobbled up so much empire in the Pacific, including Australia, that America would be unable to overcome, that they would already be entrenched in territory. And so what the Japanese did not intend to happen was that our aircraft carriers that had been stationed at Pearl Harbor happened to be out on a special practice mission that weekend, and the Japanese did not know that. And so when they attacked that day, they attacked for over 2 hours. Most of our airplanes and all of our aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor, and that significantly saved us. more of a catastrophe than it already was. And it is said that the Japanese, upon realizing this and considering American will and determination, Admiral Yamamoto, who was in charge of this attack, said, "I fear that we have awakened a sleeping giant." In other words, we should have just left it alone and empire build and not attack America, but they made a pretty bad mistake. And so as a result of that attack, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, calling it an attack that will live, a day that will live in infamy. And Congress gave him that declaration of war. So we declared war on Japan, but we still had not declared war on Germany, even though Japan and Germany were allies. The United States holds the privilege, I guess you could say, or the special situation that we are the only country during World War II that Adolf Hitler actually declared war against. Once America declared war on Japan, Germany announced its declaration of war against the United States. And that is what ultimately brought us to the rescue of the British Empire and the French. And we became fully engaged in a two-front war from December 7th, 1941 forward. Okay, so I'm going to end the lesson there today. So that's World War II, Part 1. I look forward to seeing what your comments are on your Google Classroom stream about Adolf Hitler. Please watch the lecture, I'm assuming you are watching. Watch all of the video clips I have associated with this lesson. Make sure you've taken good notes. I don't have any homework assignment for you, so other than this. So I will catch up with you guys on Wednesday, and we will do World War II Part 2. So anyway, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.